Okay, so this is a talk about Hobbes's fifth law of nature, which is mentioned very, very rarely in the Hobbes literature. So first I want to thank Jovan Babic for inviting me here and Vojan Rajcik for inviting me here. I feel very honored to speak with Hobbes scholars in Belgrade and very impressed by the number of people who are interested in Hobbes. So I've come to think that the fifth law of nature is a very important law. The first, second, third, fourth are tremendously important, but the fifth is also very important, and it has important implications for where to think of Hobbes in the context of contemporary political philosophy. So I think the implications are very broad. So I asked Professor Babic, are those the handouts?
Yeah.
So if you can distribute this, because a lot of this is just looking at the text, and I thought it would be easier for you to follow, because I'm reading the paper, if you have some of the text. So I put in some of the most important passages so you can all have it in front of you. So the Enlightenment social contract theories advanced by Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau are widely acknowledged for their role in informing our understanding of modern liberal democratic states. The theories are similar to each other in that they each present an account of the authority of the state as deriving from the will of its free and independent citizens. Aside from that underlying structural similarity, these theories took radically different positions on the issue of property. It is striking that the views of Locke and Rousseau are well known, and they have their heirs in contemporary moral and political theory. Rousseau and his socialist and communitarian followers see property as a common resource to be shared among the population for the public weal. Locke and today's libertarians see property as a sacrosanct personal domain of absolute authority. For them, individuals have property rights in their own bodies and anything with which they mix their labor. Any claim to a share of that property is usurpation. Yet few who are somewhat familiar with this social contract tradition could explain Hobbes's position on these critical issues. It is fair to say that property was not a central focus of Hobbes's attention. The oversight begins with the fact that Hobbes's fifth law of nature has been largely ignored in the literature that is devoted to explicating his work and exploring his legacy. Ignoring this critical law and all of its implications leaves an important feature of Hobbes's legacy unexplored. It deprives us of a full picture of his project and denies him of the credit he is due for articulating his groundbreaking position. The aim of this paper is, therefore, to piece together an account of Hobbes's view on the place of property ownership in civil society. In what follows, I shall present the relevant bits that Hobbes has written on the subject in Leviathan and show how they amount to a significant statement of social and economic policy. I shall be piecing together what he says in order to reveal that Hobbes's views are very compatible with contemporary contractarian constructivists such as Rawls and Scanlon. As I see it, Hobbes viewed the desire for control over property as just one among many incompatible individual desires that have to be taken into account. These competing desires have to be resolved into public policies that are supported by broadly endorsed reasons that serve some significant social purpose, most centrally the maintenance of peace and security. So the fifth law of nature. The laws of nature define the principles and virtues that are central in his theory. So I turn to the fifth law of nature, which declared his position. In chapter 15 of Leviathan, Hobbes completes his enumeration and justification for the first 19 laws of natures that began in chapter 14 by explaining the first two. The squib in the margin announces that his account of the fifth mutual accommodation or complaisance. So he says, a fifth law of nature is complaisance. That is to say, that every man strive to accommodate himself to the rest. For the understanding whereof we may consider that there is in men's aptness to society a diversity of nature arising from their diversity of affections, not unlike to that we see in stones, brought together for building an edifice. For as that stone, which by the asperity and irregularity of figure takes more room from others than itself fills, and for the hardness cannot be easily made plain, and thereby hindereth the building, is by the builder cast away as unprofitable and troublesome. So also a man, by asperity of nature, will strive to retain those things which to himself are superfluous, and to others necessary. And for the stubbornness of his passions cannot be corrected, is to be left or cast out of society as cumbersome thereunto, foreseeing every man not only by right, but also by necessity of nature, is supposed to endeavor all he can to obtain that which is necessary for his conservation. He that shall oppose himself against it for things superfluous is guilty of the war that thereupon is to follow, and therefore doth that which is contrary to the fundamental law of nature, which commandeth to seek peace. The observers of this law may be called sociable, the contrary stubborn, insociable, froward, intractable. So this is the statement of the fifth law of nature, and it has a lot in it. The comparison of people who hoard wealth to stones that have to be cast out is very dramatic, and the recognition of the importance of responding to needs for necessities is the central piece. So this law certainly requires us to be accommodating by making space for others in a crowded elevator, and by removing our coats from the seat beside us in a movie theater as it fills up. So this law, if you take it seriously, it directs actions in all sorts of social situations, and I just gave two. But if this room were to fill up and you had your bag on the chair, you would take it off to make room for other people. That's required by this law of mutual accommodation. Hobbes's justification of the fifth law reminds his readers that the right of nature allows a person to do whatever is necessary for his conservation. To demonstrate that the laws of nature must remain alert to the right of nature and to take it into account, his reminder is repeated a few paragraphs later in his account of the 10th law of nature against arrogance, where he warns that, quote, so it is necessary for a man's life to retain some as right to govern their own bodies, enjoy air, water, motion, ways to go from place to place, and all things else without which a man cannot live or live well. His cautionary reminder of the connection between complaisance and the right of nature makes it clear that a person who is without the necessities of life cannot be relied upon to conform with the civil law. Experience in our own lifetimes should have taught us what Hobbes knew, that a person who lacks bread and other basic goods is not inclined to behave peaceably. Rather, such people are willing to engage in theft, murder, riot, and revolution. Their needs, as well as their resentment of others who hold on to their superfluity in the face of their own hardships, makes those who lack basic goods extraordinarily dangerous to the stability of a society. At the same time, those who refuse to cooperate in preventing or rectifying such dangers are inviting a return to war. The fifth law of nature goes further in making the radical and positive claim that we should be willing to redistribute superfluous goods for the sake of achieving and maintaining peace. The person who is not inclined to cooperate by sharing riches is lacking in the moral virtue of mutual accommodation and is and his unreasonable refusal to comply with this law of nature is unjust. Earlier in the text, Hobbes explicitly identified and disparages two of the passions that may lead a person to be intractably unaccommodating. One is the desire of riches, which he calls covetousness, a name used always in signification of blame. Those are Hobbes's words. The other is, quote, the desire of things that conduce but little to our ends, and fear of things that are but little hindrance, pusillanimity. Although these may be natural and even common desires, in order to abide by the fifth law of nature, we should resist and retain such desires and never act on them. And I think we get this idea of never acting on them from the idea that they always signify blame. They're always wrong. So this is like an Aristotelian definition of the virtue and an extreme, this kind of desire of riches, covetousness, and pusillanimity. They're always an extreme. They're always wrong. The way murder is always wrong. So the state of nature. To fully appreciate the force and meaning of the fifth law of nature, it is necessary to look back to Hobbes's description of the state of nature. We all recall that in such a condition there is no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society. This list of the riches that the well-off enjoy should remind the covetous and the pusillanimous that they would not be able to count on having any of these treasures which they desire and cling to if civil society should collapse into chaos and revolution. To make the point crystal clear, Hobbes makes the further point that in the state of nature, it is consequent also to the same condition that there be no propriety, no dominion, no mine and thine distinct, but only that to be every man that he can get, and only for so long as he can keep it, and so much for the ill condition which man by mere nature is actually placed in. So the covetous and the pusillanimous, they'd have nothing if society disappears. This statement serves as a warning about the absence of security and property if and when civil society should be disbanded. It also declares Hobbes's view about property ownership. Because there is no propriety and no dominion in the state of nature, there is no natural right to property. That claim suggests that property and dominion are creations of civil society. They are artificial arrangements that are properly designed and altered to serve the goal of creating and preserving peace. The rights of the sovereign. In that light, Hobbes makes several telling declarations in chapter 18 of the rights of sovereigns by institution. There he affirms that, quote, it belongeth of right to whatsoever man or assembly that hath the sovereignty to be judge both of the means of peace and defense, and to do whatsoever he shall think necessary be done, both beforehand for the preserving of peace and security, by prevention of discord at home and hostility from abroad, and when peace and security are lost, for the recovery of the same. When people lack the necessities of life, it is clear that peace is threatened and discord may break out at home. For Hobbes, the sovereign therefore has the right to do whatever will prevent or forestall insurrection. That necessity requires the sovereign to maintain the power to declare rules about ownership and private property, and Hobbes states this explicitly later in chapter 18. He says, seventhly, it is annexed to the sovereignty the power of prescribing the rules whereby every man may know what goods he may enjoy and what actions he may do without being molested by any of his fellow subjects. And this is it men call propriety. For before constitution of sovereign power, all men had right to all things, which necessarily causeth war, and therefore this propriety being necessary for peace and depending on sovereign power is the act of that power in order to the public peace. These rules of propriety, or of meum and tium, are the civil laws, that is to say, the laws of each commonwealth in particular. Property rights are therefore local, created by the ordinances of the state, and they may be altered to meet the changing circumstances and the exigencies that arise. In Chapter 21 of the Liberty of Subjects, Hobbes makes explicit both the sovereign's authority over property rights and the fact that he may later change any allocation that he makes. For him, property rights are nothing like the immutable laws of nature. They are tools that can and should be manipulated in the service of achieving and maintaining peace. He writes, and therefore such liberty is in some places more and in some less, and in some times more, in other times less, according as they that have the sovereignty shall think most convenient. As, for example, there was a time in England when a man might enter into his own land and dispossess such as wrongfully possessed it by force. But in later times, that liberty of forcible entry was taken away by statute. So this tells us that the sovereign can make laws about who owns what and can also change laws. Whatever rights you have or property are given by the sovereign and can be changed by the sovereign. In Chapter 23 of the Public Ministers of Sovereign Power, Hobbes again makes this point. There he explains that at home, ministers have the job of extracting revenue at the command of the sovereign, that is, collecting the money that represents a portion of the subject's property and which functions as the blood to sustain the state. He says, first, for the economy of a commonwealth, they that have authority concerning the treasure, as tributes, impositions, rents, fines, or whatever public revenue, to collect, receive, issue, or take the accounts thereof, are public ministers. Ministers because they serve the person representative and can do nothing against his command, nor without his authority. Public because they serve him in his political capacity. Hobbes continues in Chapter 14 of the nutrition and procreation of a commonwealth to explain further details of how the distribution or redistribution of anything that might count as property falls under the direction of the sovereign. Significantly, in describing how the children of Israel divide the promised land, he explains that the allocation was by, quote, by the discretion of Eleazar the priest and Joshua their general, which division was therefore arbitrary. And there you can see traces of this also in the 14th law of nature in discussion in Chapter 15. Again, this assertion denies any natural claim to property rights or any other basis for limiting the sovereign's authority in redistribution for the sake of achieving or maintaining peace. He goes on to say, the nutrition of the commonwealth consisteth in the plenty and distribution of materials conducing to life, in the concoction or preparation, and when concocted, in the conveyance of it by convenient conduits to the public. And the distribution of the materials of this nourishment is the constitution of mine and thine and his. That is to say, in one word, property, and belongeth in all kinds of commonwealth to the sovereign power. And he continues, there's a lot in Chapter 24. In this distribution, the first law is for the division of the land itself, wherein the sovereign assigneth to every man a portion according as he, and not according as any subject or any of number of them shall judge agreeable to equity and the common good. And he continues, propriety of a subject excludes not the dominion of the sovereign, but only of another subject. For seeing the sovereign is understood to do nothing but in order to the common peace and security, this distribution of land is to be understood as done in order to the same. And he goes on in chapter 24 to say, the laws of transferring propriety belong also to the sovereign. Further seeing it is not enough to the sustentation of a commonwealth that every man have propriety in a portion of land or in some few commodities or a natural property in some useful art, and there is no art in the world but is necessary either for the being or well-being almost of every particular man. It is necessary that men distribute that which they can spare and transfer their property therein mutually to one another by exchange and mutual contract. And therefore it belongeth to the commonwealth to appoint in what manner all kinds of contracts between subjects are to be made. I think in this section it's very important to notice that he extends the notion of property to natural property to things that are few commodities, so rare things, and also to these natural property in some useful art. So think of a useful art. I think of medicine because that's where I spend most of my time. So imagine a physician having the power to cure somebody of a deadly disease, and that somebody who is ill is your child or grandchild, and you don't have the funds to pay that person as much as they would want for it. You're ready to kill them. So whatever this useful art may be is a matter that the sovereign could have distributed or redistributed. There's a famous paper by Judith Jarvis Thompson where someone who's sick is in the hospital, and this person wants most of all the cool touch of some famous actor's hand. Now imagine that that actor has some extra time. The sovereign, if it really helps people in a very significant way, the sovereign could command that actor to go and put his cool hand on many foreheads because it conduces to the common peace. So there is nothing, according to this account, that doesn't count as a commodity or a concoction or a natural power that doesn't fall under the description of what a sovereign may distribute or redistribute. And if you remember, in the state of nature, a person in defense of himself can use anything, even another person's body. So access to your body is even something that the sovereign has control over, can distribute or redistribute for the common good. That's why the sovereign can order people to go to war.
So there are no natural rights?
There are no natural rights to property. None.
Or whatever, in the sense in which Judith Thompson would say that Frank Sinatra had the right not to go there to...
Right. So this is quite extreme, I think. And this natural property in some useful art, and there is no art in the world but is necessary either for the well-being or well-being almost of every particular man. It's very, very inclusive, what he's talking about. Hobbes also asserts the sovereign's right to extract property in the form of pecuniary punishment in order to promote obedience to the civil law. In chapter 28, he explains that this may consist, quote, not only of the deprivation of a sum of money, but also of lands or any other goods which are usually bought or sold for money. So the sovereign can confiscate things as fines, your money, your property, anything. To make his position on property absolutely unambiguous, Hobbes goes on to deny positions to the contrary that were asserted in his time in opposition to actions such as property seizure and taxation by the sovereign, and later embraced by Locke and his followers. He does this not once, but with uncharacteristic redundancy 4 times in chapter 29, and once more for good measure in chapter 30. In chapter 29, writing of those things that weaken or tend to the dissolution of a commonwealth, he lists, "A fifth doctrine that tendeth to the dissolution of a commonwealth is that every private man has an absolute propriety in his goods, such as excludeth the rights of a sovereign." So this is saying, he's saying this statement is false. Okay? Every man has indeed a propriety that excludes the right of every other subject, and he has it only from the sovereign power, without the protection whereof every other man should have equal right to the same. But if the right of the sovereign also be excluded, he cannot perform the office they have put him into, which is to defend them both from foreign enemies and from the injuries of one another. And consequently, there is no longer a commonwealth. He goes on to say, diseases of a commonwealth. At first, the difficulty of raising money for the necessary uses of the commonwealth, especially in the approach of war. This difficulty arises from the opinion that every subject hath a propriety in his lands and goods, exclusive of sovereign right to use the same. Again, he's saying this is a false belief. From whence it cometh to pass that the sovereign power, which foreseeth the necessity and dangers of the commonwealth, finding the passage of the money to the public treasure obstructed by the inactivity of the people, whereas it ought to extend itself to encounter and prevent such dangers in their beginning. And he goes on to say, and again there is sometime in a commonwealth a disease which resembleth a pleurisy, and that is when the treasure of the commonwealth flowing out of its due course is gathered together in too much abundance in one or a few private men. So he's arguing against the accumulation of wealth as a danger to the public. And he goes on to say, in chapter 30, as I have heard some say, that justice is but a word without substance, echoes of what the fool would say, you notice, and that whatsoever a man can by force or art acquire to himself, not only in the condition of war, but also in the commonwealth, is his own, which I have also showed to be false. So these views of fools are false. Once Hobbes has articulated the general framework for his position on property, he makes short shrift of the details about what is required to achieve distributive justice. What he does say, however, is remarkably progressive. In chapter 30 of the Office of the Sovereign Representative, he begins by explaining the procuration of the good of the people. There he offers that the office of the sovereign consisteth in the end for which he was trusted with the sovereign power, namely the procuration of the safety of the people. But safety here is not meant a bare preservation, but also all other contentments of life, which every man by lawful industry without danger or hurt of the commonwealth shall acquire to himself. So here he's taking a rather expansive view of what is owed to each citizen, not merely sustenance, but what's required for the contentments of life. There has to be a more general distribution, and the bottom line isn't eking out sustenance, but a contented life, what he later calls in other places commodious living. His powerful statement proclaims the importance of assuring safety to every man, as well as a share of the goods of the Commonwealth. Here his momentous claim is that a fair share of those goods is not meant a bare preservation, the basic minimum, which is the standard fare mentioned in contemporary tracts on political justice. Instead, Hobbes calls for the assurance of that plus all other contentments of life. This declaration that individuals should be assured a robust share of the resources of the Commonwealth expresses his deep insight into human nature. Glory makes everyone believe that he is entitled to a share of the good life and as entitled as others are. Furthermore, people who have all the contentments of life have a genuine vested interest in the state's survival and no significant reason to undermine the peace at home. States that merely provide for the minimum that is essential for survival and leave many subjects dissatisfied with their niggardly lot, particularly when they see others enjoying great wealth and luxury, invite rebellion. Furthermore, he cautions that, quote, the rich and potent subjects of a kingdom, quote, unquote, are likely to obstruct the sovereign in the enactment of his duty because their affections prevent them from appreciating the dictates of reason. Hobbes continues in this vein by explaining that equal justice, which the sovereign is required to dispense, entails equal imposition of taxes, which he ties to consumption, and also public charity, which we today describe as social welfare support. If public charity is a proper responsibility of the sovereign, it is a right of the subjects. In this sense, it would not be like other charity, a free gift, because that would make it uncertain and not allow a subject to rely upon it as a matter of the Commonwealth's responsibility to a subject. Hobbes explains the scope of this responsibility. Presumably, the justification for public charity would again be peace and security of those who would otherwise be malcontent and inclined to rebellion, he writes. And whereas many men by accident inevitable become unable to maintain themselves by their labor, they ought not to be left to the charity of private persons, but to be provided for as far forth as the necessities of nature require by the laws of the Commonwealth. For as is uncharitableness in any man to neglect the impotent, so it is in the sovereign of a commonwealth to expose them to the hazard of such uncertain charity. So that he says in chapter 30. Hobbes continues by discussing the prevention of idleness. There he takes a position that amounts to required job training for able-bodied and exile for the overpopulation of hard and disruptive ones that can threaten society and therefore have to be cast away. He offers, quote, but for such as have strong bodies, the case is otherwise. They are to be forced to work, and to avoid the excuse of not finding employment, there ought to be such laws as may encourage all manner of arts, as navigation, agriculture, fishing, and all manner of manufacture that requires labor. The multitude of poor and yet strong people still increasing, they are to be transplanted into countries not sufficiently inhabited. So the Americas, Australia, good places to send those people. So finally, conclusion. This reading of Hobbes's fifth law of nature and how he elaborates it in his discussion of property ownership acknowledges that the needy have a moral claim on the excess within their society. Although Hobbes does not elaborate fully on what is entailed in the original distribution and later redistributions, he does discuss money and taxation and the broad powers of the sovereign in regulating transactions to accomplish the general goal of meeting basic needs and sharing the luxuries provided by the society. All of this is explained in terms of the necessity of maintaining social stability. Hobbes clearly is no libertarian. Hobbes, like the contractarian constructivists of today, saw nothing sacred in the acquisition of property. Policies for the distribution of goods must conform to the governing standard of promoting stability and justice within society. For him, property rights, as well as rights to basic goods, emerge from the construction. Neither rights to property nor rights to basic goods are primary givens or a priori values. In the discussion above, I made the case for Hobbes, clearly seeing the far-reaching implications of the fifth law of nature, particularly with respect to the allocation of property. Reading Hobbes, by keeping the importance of the fifth law of nature in focus, allows us to appreciate that it commands not only redistribution of things as food, shelter, and access to health care, but attention to the design of social structures so as to assure that the opportunities to compete and attain the means to compete for positions and offices will be open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Here I'm quoting Rawls from Political Liberalism. In fact, Hobbes explicitly expressed his awareness of concerns for such issues in his discussion of rights of sovereigns by institutions, where he lists, quote, and of honors and order as the 12th sovereign right, and there he explains that considering what values men are apt to set upon themselves, what respect they look for from others, and how little they value other men, from whence continually arrive amongst them emulation, quarrel, factions, and at last war, it is necessary that there be laws of honor and a public rate of worth of such men as have deserved it or are able to deserve well of the Commonwealth, and that there be force in the hands of some or other to put these laws in execution. The concerns that captured Hobbes's attention are certainly very different from the concerns that contemporary contractarian constructivists find pressing. This difference leads them to emphasize very different implications of their position, and that gives a very different tone to their works. Specifically, Hobbes was worried about controlling the charismatic, the vainglorious, and the powerful, while today's contractarians are worried about empowering the weak. Also, the particular political issues of the mid-17th century are vastly different from those at the dawn of the 21st. Over the intervening centuries, some questions have been settled and new ones have come to the fore. Hobbes devoted a lot of space to explaining the obedience of subjects to civil authority and the relationship of a Christian's religious obligations to his civil duties. Today's theorists write in an era and milieu that is far less concerned with issues of obedience to religious authority and much more focused on the complex social problems of a radically pluralistic, multicultural society, the difficulty of economic questions that emerge with rapid growth and movement of wealth, and the unusual institutional issues that develop out of dramatic changes in technology that shift traditional establishment roles. These marked differences in focus and the contemporary challenges they confront account for a significant difference in the overall effect of the presentation. That's it.